For 500 years, the galaxy was silent. Then, Earth sent a single signal and terrorized every living soul.
500 years is a long time to hold your breath. For half a millennium, Earth answered nothing. No calls, no signatures, no acknowledgments. The stars blazed, the galaxy roared with traffic. Empires rose and warred and bargained, and one small blue world kept its mouth shut. Most species wrote it off as extinction. A few catalogued it as a curiosity. The Velthari Confederation, rulers of 800 star systems and the de facto voice of the civilized galaxy, did not write it off at all. They simply forgot it existed, the way an emperor forgets a moth in a forgotten warehouse, the way a god forgets a prayer that never quite rose above the noise of the crowd. That mistake would burn their sky. For 5 centuries, every hyperspace lane carried whispers. The Pact of Nine held the peace. Trade flowed like warm blood through the arteries of the rim. The Velthari patrolled the core worlds in gleaming capital ships older than most sentient species had been alive. The Ashkari held the outer dark with patience and memory, the only race the Velthari had ever learned to call equal. And everyone else, every smaller species, every younger empire, every client kingdom and tributary band, learned to bow when the flags passed, learned to lower their eyes, learned to smile at the right jokes at the right time. Earth's silence was a rumor in diplomatic archives, a footnote in xenology courses at the Academy on Velthar Prime, a punchline among junior officers who liked to laugh about the species that quit the galaxy before it learned to walk. Some said humanity had nuked itself into ash. Some said a plague had emptied the cradle. Some said they were simply scared of what was out here, scared of the size of the dark, scared of the things that moved inside it. Nobody checked. Nobody cared. The galaxy had grown big, and big things have a way of stopping noticing small things. But quiet is not the same as dead. Every probe launched from Earth in those 500 years had been small, slow, dark, and utterly unremarkable. No faster-than-light signatures, no antimatter plumes, no weapons-grade transmissions, no pride. They drifted on solar sails past bored Velthari patrol cruisers that logged them as comet debris, as ice chunks from a remote Oort, as the silent flotsam of a forgotten system. They mapped the dark. They catalogued the lanes. They watched the great powers the way ants study wolves, patient and very, very still. They whispered home in tight pulses nobody was listening for, in bands nobody had thought to monitor, in patterns so quiet they sat beneath the floor of every sensor the Confederation owned, and the wolves never once turned to look. Then, one morning along the Velthari frontier, a convoy carrying 14,000 enslaved Krell workers vanished into the dark. The Krell were a soft species, amphibious, gentle, kept by the Confederation for their engineering labor and for their bioluminescent skin, which the Velthari aristocracy wore as jewelry, as trim, as living decoration on collars worn to court. The convoy was unremarkable. The route was unremarkable. The cargo manifest was routine freight. The disappearance, however, was not. There were no distress beacons. There were no debris fields. There were no scorch marks on the moons around the drop point. There were no drifting life pods. 14,000 beings simply ceased, and the silence they left behind was the loudest sound the outer sectors had ever heard. 2 days later, a single Velthari patrol cruiser came apart around its own midsection. No warning. No incoming fire on sensors. One moment it was cruising at standard patrol speed, crew sipping coffee, an officer laughing about a bet on the gladiatorial season. The next, its spine cracked like an eggshell, pressure venting in long white plumes, atmosphere screaming into the void, bodies spilling out like seeds from a broken pod. The black box survived. The black box recorded nothing. Officers on the bridge had time to look surprised. That was all. That was everything they had. Surprise. And then the long quiet. By the third day, 4 more ships were gone. An orbital station at Thessa Major, holding 11,000 civilians, went dark mid-transmission. A communications relay near the Ashkari border stopped broadcasting mid-syllable, its final word frozen in static, never to be finished. And that unfinished word was the name of a child. Cargo haulers stopped checking in across a swath of space 3 light-years wide. The Confederation convened an emergency session on Velthar Prime in the great marble palace hanging above its crown jewel world. Admirals shouted. Senators pointed fingers at each other, and at the Ashkari, and at anyone they had ever disliked. Priests quoted old texts about hubris. The High Arbiter, a being of terrifying patience who had ruled the Confederation for 3 centuries, sat in silence while the room fractured around him like ice on a warming lake. Then the first human transmission in 500 years arrived. It was not a greeting. It was not a plea. It was not a negotiation. It was a single file, addressed to the High Arbiter by his full ceremonial name, broadcast on every Velthari frequency, every diplomatic channel, every military band, every commercial relay, every pirate frequency, every children's educational network. The file contained the complete internal sensor logs of the missing convoy, the patrol cruiser, the station, the relay, every frame, every second, every terrified last breath of 14,000 Krell, and every Velthari officer who had looked surprised at the end. It also contained something else, something that made the High Arbiter lean forward in his carved obsidian chair for the first time in living memory. Something that made the room behind him go absolutely, clinically, professionally silent. Schematics. Ship schematics. Velthari capital class schematics, accurate to the bolt, annotated by hands that knew which bolts mattered. The accompanying text was 6 words long. Return what you took from Krell Prime. The room went cold. Not because the demand was unreasonable. It was, in fact, surprisingly reasonable, almost polite. The kind of measured ask a seasoned diplomat might draft after a strong cup of tea and a long walk through a quiet garden. The room went cold because of what it implied. Earth had watched the convoy. Earth had watched the patrol. Earth had watched the station. Earth had watched the relay. Earth had watched, in real time, with sensors the Confederation's flagship could not detect. Sensors that had slipped past every patrol, every audit, every proud Velthari inspection for half a millennium. The silence was not the silence of a dead species. The silence was not even the silence of a sleeping species. The silence was the silence of a hunter holding its breath beside a sleeping dragon, and the dragon had just opened one eye. The High Arbiter did not panic. He was 3 centuries old. He had weathered 2 civil wars, an Ashkari siege that lasted 11 years, the plague of brass and the long humiliation of his own house after it. He leaned back in his chair, studied the schematics as a jeweler studies a stolen diamond, and made his decision with the calm of a man who had never once been contradicted by reality. He would not negotiate with ghosts. He would not apologize for thrift, which is what Velthari aristocrats called slavery when it suited them. He would teach the galaxy's forgotten species, in one swift, public, unforgettable lesson, exactly what happened when rats remembered they had teeth. He dispatched the Third Armada. 300 ships, 15,000 heavy marines, the pride of the Confederation, the fleet that had broken the Ashkari at Karis IV, the fleet that had glassed the Moisin colonies for the crime of asking too many questions, the fleet that had parades on every anniversary and hymns sung in every temple. They burned hard toward the coordinates the human file had exposed. The High Arbiter was certain those coordinates were bluff, certain they were empty, certain they were a last desperate gasp from a species that had finally run out of time. He sat back in his chair, poured himself wine older than most civilizations, and waited for the kill report with the patience of a man who had never been told no. It did not come. For 9 days, the Third Armada moved at combat speed toward the human coordinates. Internal communications were steady. Sensor sweeps came back clean. Pilots joked in the mess halls about Earth, about how quaint it would be to see a palace built out of mud, a fleet of junkers held together with prayer and baling wire. Their grandmothers had fought real wars. They were going on a camping trip. They sent home pictures of themselves smiling, holding drinks, posing in front of their guns in formation photos that would be posted to family channels and liked by 1,000 cousins. On the 10th day, every ship in the Third Armada received the same transmission. It was the same 6 words. Return what you took from Krell Prime. And then the sky turned wrong. The first volley did not come from ahead. It did not come from behind. It did not come from above or below, or from any direction printed on any chart the Confederation had ever drawn. It came from inside the formation, from blind spots the Velthari had never thought to defend, from points in space that, according to every map the Confederation possessed, were empty, were vacuum, were nothing at all. There were no silhouettes. There were no engine flares. There was no charge-up on any spectrum, no buildup of energy, no polite warning ping that something terrible was about to happen. There was simply a soft pulse of light that did not behave like light, that bent around hull plating like water around a stone, that touched the Third Armada all at once, every ship, every vector, every proud flag, with the gentleness of a mother tucking a child into bed. Then the lights went out. Ships did not explode. That is important. Ships did not crack. They did not burn. They did not suffer the dramatic, photogenic deaths that Velthari public relations had spent centuries preparing the homeworld to expect from its heroes. They simply stopped working. Reactors froze mid-cycle. FTL drives shut down, as if someone had reached into their souls and turned a key. Shields dropped. Life support dropped. Navigation dropped. Turrets spun uselessly into the dark. The Great Armada hung in space like a museum exhibit, perfectly intact, perfectly silent, perfectly dead in every way that mattered. 2 hours passed like 2 years. Then the second volley arrived. It was louder. It was less polite. Hull plating peeled away from 300 Velthari ships in unison, exposing their spines, their decks, their startled crews, their smiling faces frozen on pictures they would never send home, their drinks still half full on mess tables, their jokes still half told in transcripts that would never be finished. The peel was not random. It was surgical. It was choreographed. It exposed exactly enough to let vacuum in, and not 1 micron more. The crews died in rows. They died in the same posture they had held when the wine was still in their cups. They died as if the universe had simply decided their story was over and turned the page. Only 1 ship was spared. the flagship. The personal vessel of the Armada's admiral, who had once toasted the High Arbiter's health on 16 separate occasions. Its plating peeled back just enough to let one message through. One final humiliation broadcast on every Confederate frequency. One note attached to the corpse of the Third Armada's pride for every being in the galaxy to read. The note was not 6 words this time. It was 4. We are not extinct. On Velthar Prime, the High Arbiter dropped his ancient wine. It stained the marble floor a color that, in the old Velthari tongue, was the same word as regret and the same word as before, because the Velthari used one word for both, because their ancestors believed every humiliation had already happened once and was only now being remembered. He summoned his advisors. He summoned his priests. He summoned his military historians, his xenologists, his archivists, his shame. He asked them the only question that mattered now, the question no one in the room wanted to answer, the question the marble walls seemed to lean in to hear. How long had Earth been watching? The answer came from a junior xenologist, a small being with ink-stained fingers who had spent her career studying exactly the wrong species to advance her career. A quiet woman the elders had ignored at every conference for 2 decades. She stood up in a room full of terrified elders and laid out the math. The probe signatures had been there for 500 years. The Krell had been watched for 140. The Velthari had been mapped for 212.
The Ashkari had been mapped for 196.
Earth had not gone silent because it had died. Earth had not gone silent because it was scared. Earth had gone silent because it had learned. And what it had learned, it had written down. The galaxy had spent 5 centuries laughing at a closed door. Behind that door, humanity had quietly catalogued every fleet movement, every treaty, every vulnerability, every boast, every parade, every lie, every hyperspace signature of every proud ship that ever crossed the rim. Human children had grown up studying Velthari command architecture the way other children studied fairy tales. Human engineers had reverse-engineered hyperspace lanes by riding them as passengers in stolen freighters, by being very polite and very forgettable, by smiling at the right jokes at the right time. Human soldiers had trained in silence against imagined enemies, and when those enemies finally arrived, they were smaller, slower, weaker, and far less patient than the simulations had prepared them to be. The simulations had prepared them well. And they had not acted alone. As if to prove the point, every Ashkari border post simultaneously received a single transmission that night. The Ashkari were the Confederation's ancient rivals, the only species the Velthari had ever truly feared. A quiet reptilian empire built on patience and memory, and a long, slow memory of grudges. For 300 years, the two powers had held an uneasy peace, neither willing to test the other, neither willing to look weak in front of the smaller beasts. Now, in a single night, the Ashkari High Court received a copy of every Velthari weakness the humans had collected, annotated, indexed, cross-referenced, and delivered in a format so clean, so respectful, so infuriatingly professional that the Ashkari chancellor reportedly laughed for the first time in 40 years. They signed a treaty that morning. 2 hours later, they signed 3 more. By the next evening, the Ashkari Third Fleet had changed heading. Within a week, Velthari colonial garrisons across 200 light-years began receiving human diplomats wearing the Ashkari crest on their sleeves. Not as supplicants, not as prisoners, as partners. They carried credentials in languages the Confederation had not bothered to learn. They carried terms written in a tone the Confederation had not heard in living memory. Not the tone of the weak, not the tone of the late, not the tone of the small. The tone of the patient. The Confederation, for the first time in its very long memory, faced a war on two fronts. And one of those fronts was led by a species it had mocked for half a millennium, while that species memorized its bones. The galaxy did not learn that day. The galaxy learned over the following months, in a slow, painful public education that no propaganda office could spin. Human ships appeared at neutral ports, wearing no insignia, demanding no tribute, asking only for the return of the Krell who had been stolen, dispersed, sold, worn, integrated into jewelry, into clothing, into the floors of aristocratic mansions on a dozen core worlds. The demand was met, ship by ship, colony by colony, sometimes quietly, sometimes at the point of a gun that did not even need to fire. Each return was a small humiliation. Each small humiliation was a reminder. Earth had not disappeared into the dark on purpose. Earth had been counting. And Earth was done counting. The final lesson came on the 1-year anniversary of the Krell convoy's disappearance. Every frequency in the galaxy, every broadcast band, every civilian channel, every children's nursery rhyme, every prison comm, every admiral's private line, every listening post on every continent and every moon carried the same signal at the same moment. It was a sound, not words, not a threat. A single tone, low, steady, almost gentle. The kind of low, steady, almost gentle sound a heart makes when it remembers how to beat after a very long sleep. It lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, every Velthari ship at dock, every Ashkari vessel at port, every civilian freighter, every military cruiser, every listening post on every world in the galaxy stopped moving. Not because they were ordered to, not because their engines failed. They stopped because the crews inside them stopped. Because every ear that heard that tone understood, somewhere deeper than training, deeper than doctrine, that the dark had just spoken, and the dark had meant it. The tone was not loud. The tone was exact. It was tuned so precisely to the structural resonance of every known hull design, every inhabited station, every pressurized habitat under Confederation or Ashkari care, that engineers who later studied the recordings could not stop their hands from shaking. It was a ping, a single sonar ping, sent into the dark, asking one question of every metal surface in the galaxy. Are you there? The message was not directed at the Confederation. The message was not directed at the Ashkari. The message was not directed at any single throne, any single flag, any single proud admiral who still believed he understood the shape of the war. The message was directed at every civilization, every species, every future empire that might one day glance at a small blue world and decide it was small, decide it was late, decide it was safe to forget. The message was simple. The message was cold. The message would outlast every treaty currently signed, every throne currently occupied, every proud flag currently hanging in the void. Earth was awake, and Earth had measured every wall. The galaxy had measured Earth in centuries. Earth had measured the galaxy in seconds. The balance of power did not shift that day. The balance of power had shifted long before, quietly, patiently, in the dark, while the loud ones had been busy being loud, while the proud ones had been busy being proud, while the ancient ones had been busy forgetting what the young ones remembered. The galaxy finally understood why Earth had stayed silent. The silence had not been surrender. The silence had not been death. The silence had been the loudest thing Earth had ever done, and the galaxy had simply not been listening yet. From that night forward, every admiral who pulled his fleet into dock did it with one eye on the dark. Because the dark, they now knew, had finally learned to answer back. The galaxy had long memories. Earth had longer ones. And Earth remembers in seconds.